Adventures of Boxman, Episode 1, The Fall of the Bucephalus, narrated by Cilan Steele. Part 1, The Vessel. As the engine sputtered erratically throughout its trip, it quickly became known by the ship's pilot and his companion that their venture would not last long. Coughing up a final cloud of thick smoke, it finally fell dead, leaving only the sizzles of pressure and heat within its pipes. The ship was left adrift, not in a vast sea of water, but in the endless vacuum of space. When the engine failed at last, the ancient, compact vessel's inhabitants began a panic to find alternative methods of proceeding. The immense darkness around them consumed them, and it was difficult to ignore the dread of their situation. They were sitting one in front of the other, studying the outside and their centuries-old instruments for any hope. "Do you see anything?" the one in the front asked, straining to remain calm while fiddling with buttons. "Nothing," replied the other. There was only the darkness of space and the looming reality of what was after them. What would find them if they stalled any longer? Visibility through the small windows of the vessel was low. However, they could still make out patterns in the stars. There was a significant gap interrupting them, however, and shortly after noticing this gap, a blinding beam of light appeared from the edge of the space between the stars. The gap was a planet made invisible against the pitch-black background by its dark atmosphere, and made visible to them by its star. There was a sigh of relief by the partners as the new opportunity presented itself, as if by divine intervention. The celestial body was uninhabited, as it was not registered on any galactic database and its being so, and a plan was immediately made to crash land on its surface. The plan of crash landing on the surface of a planet unknown to either of them may have been seen as questionable, but it was synonymously understood that any death or fortune that waited for them on it was more desirable than the alternative. With the remaining fuel in the tank of their ship, the two ignited small, insignificant thrusters that had just enough force to move them closer to the planet. They began steering the ship toward the celestial body. Along with its blue, hazy atmosphere, it had millions of vague dots forming minuscule islands. A nearby planet cast an immense shadow on the surface. "Is that water on the surface?" asked the one in the back. "It appears to be, Armani," replied the other. Compared to his companion, Armani was not as well versed in the ways of the universe, as he spent most of his life working as a farmhand on his home planet. Like most people who had not been exposed to the culture of the outside, his knowledge of it was entirely based on books and stories told by travelers. The planet gradually attracted the ship with its gravity, and the small vessel began to build speed towards its surface. They were beyond the point of no return, putting their faith in the waters of the mysterious body. As the vessel fell into the planet's atmosphere, more of its properties began to make themselves known. The dark blue haze dissolved just enough to see the rocky terrain underneath, and a particular piece of information that would destroy their hopes of landing safely. There was only a thick layer of blue-tinted fog covering the land, but no water to be seen. The two inhabitants of the ship scanned the vast surface of the planet until simultaneously coming to the same conclusion. "We need to get out of here," the commander of the ship shouted in a frenzied panic, but there was no hope left. They were falling faster every second, and they still had an irrevocable engine. The ship, which had faded lettering on the side, spelling the Bucephalus in an ancient language, burned across the deceptive atmosphere of the mysterious planet, and the pilot and his acquaintance braced themselves for impact. Part 2, The Fog. "Armani!" shouted the Bucephalus' pilot to its passenger. "Armani, are you all right?" He looked behind him, surprised to be met with an empty seat. The inside of the ship was completely dark, only lit up by the faint, glowing hue of different colored buttons and displays. The crash was much softer than anticipated, but it didn't leave the survivor unscathed. His head stung and suffered from whiplash, and his limbs were beaten up by the dash. After regaining his focus and equipping an old oxygen mask, he opened the latch of the Bucephalus, letting out a hiss of steam. The ship opened up, and the man inside scanned the area around him after his eyes adjusted to the dull but strong colors. There was a strong, unrelenting fog surrounding him, mixed with colors of blue, green, and gray. It was so dense he could barely make out the rocky ground below him. He stepped out of the vessel and onto the crunchy soil. He couldn't see much through the dense haze, but the landscape was quite flat, except for one particularly unique aspect of the planet, the long spikes of rock that towered over him for hundreds of feet. After a short time passed, the sky darkened immensely as night began. He had two goals: finding shelter so he may rest, and searching for his lost companion. He did not know Armani for a long time, but he still cared for his survival. There was no evidence of Armani leading from the wreck, prompting the wanderer to fear the worst. After an hour of traveling in random directions and shouting Armani's name, he came across a clearing with much less fog, and exhausted from the series of events he had just experienced, he collapsed, freezing and starving, but at least a little safer with more visibility. He searched the bag he had brought with him more thoroughly and pulled out, one by one, the contents of it. A galactic timekeeper that had stopped working a long time ago, a set of small survival tools, a pneumatic sidearm, and a first aid kit. He laid down a foil-lined blanket to soften the ground and started to treat his body for any injuries. The day had been long, and the man grew weary. He lay down on his makeshift bed and fell asleep. Part 3. The Beginning. During his slumber, the night grew increasingly more dark. Visibility was now 0, even if the impenetrable fog wasn't still surrounding him. A faint flash of yellow light peered through the edge of the fog. It shined onto his face and danced across his eyes, prying them open. It was just bright enough to awaken him. He was still exhausted, but much less weary than before. After pulling himself up from the blanket on the ground, he brushed himself off and observed the glowing light. "Armani, are you there?" he questioned into the fog. There was no answer. He asked again, and the light faded away. Equipping his pistol, he investigated the edge of the fog. Being cautious, he held it toward the spot where the light shined and walked towards it slowly. His body ached everywhere, both physically and mentally, distraught from the reality of being stranded alone on a remote planet. He stood at the very edge of the fogless plain and leaned into it, shouting his companion's name one last time, when he got hit with a very strong force into the stomach, knocking him to the ground. After quickly regaining his senses, he scanned the plain for the cause of the hit, but he saw nothing he'd not seen before. He rushed to his feet and ran to the center of the plain, anticipating another strike. It was a heavy, blunt force that had to have been caused directly by a living thing. A swift sound of feet stomping towards him ensued, and whatever was causing it hit him again. But he was prepared this time and stayed upright, while the entity was the one that fell, diving into the rocks beside him. A cloud of dust kicked up from the dry soil, and a trade of punching and tearing followed, during which the pistol was knocked out of his hand, landing on the ground. During the turmoil, the man finally got the creature back on the ground, and he dove towards his gun. The creature charged towards him, and in a panic, he fired a single pellet from the pistol and into the center of its chest, causing it to fall motionless. He was frozen. He had never killed another living thing in that way, and he knew nothing about this creature at his feet, now lying in a pool of black blood soaking into the rocks. Finally having a chance to observe the creature, he discovered it was light gray, giving it the ability to hide among the fog, and had rough skin as well as an odd arrangement of limbs and other features. Out of the top of its head protruded a blunt spike, perhaps explaining why it favored charging after its victims. He did not find a source of the light from the fog. He decided it was time to move on from the area. It could have been hours since the crash, maybe a full day, and there hadn't been any trace of Armani, which wasn't even the most dire of problems at the moment. After packing his things together, he ventured hopelessly into the fog. After an eternity of walking blind across the rocks, he came across a familiar place, the wreck of the Bucephalus. Dark smoke from its engine was still pouring into the sky above it, infecting the light fog. He investigated the crash site one more time. It truly did seem unfixable, especially on this planet. It was only a mess of parts and machinery, never to fly again. Prying a piece of the engine out from its compartment, the former pilot of the Bucephalus made a last resort decision to find Armani. He wrapped the blanket around himself, placed the box-shaped part onto his head, and a legend was born.